Now we've got constitutional law professor, ABC News legal analyst, and the author of the new book, Pardon Power, How the Pardon System Works and Why. Kim Wehle, thank you so much for taking the time.
Oh, great to be here with you, Brian. Thank you.
So I do want to jump into the book, but before we do that, we are living through some unprecedented legal times, obviously, and so I have to get your reaction to some new developments. So first off, Donald Trump's New York sentencing was delayed until after the election. There seems to be two schools of thought on this. The first is that Donald Trump got away with it yet again, because he always does. And the second is actually a little bit more nuanced, which the internet is famous for accepting, and that is that this actually unencumbers Judge Merchan to then impose a sentence of incarceration if he's not burdened by the prospect of impacting a presidential election, which we now know is something that weighs into his decision making here. So where do you land on this issue?
Well, if there's a sentencing date, he didn't get away with anything, just not for now. And I'm kind of in camp number two. First of all, we know from the Justice Department, of course, this is a state law prosecution. We know that there's a 60-day limit on starting new investigations. And so there's a recognition that things close to an election is probably something that the criminal justice system should stay away from. But honestly, reportedly, Trump raises so much money when there's anything that happens in these trials. So imagine Merchan wants to impose a sentence, and then he not only is going to raise a lot of money, he's going to grab all the attention of the news cycle. So Merchan's got to know it's going to divert the conversation away from the election and the issues, because Donald Trump is brilliant at that. And from my perspective, he's kind of been flailing since Kamala Harris took over the nomination. He hasn't really gotten any traction on anything other than, the stumbles of his VP candidate.
What do you say to Republicans who now claim that Judge Merchan staying the sentencing until after the election validates their claims that this is indeed election interference? Because why else would he not have imposed a sentence if not for the fact that an election was upcoming?
Well, I mean, they're masters of heads we win, tails you lose.
Right.
So I can't imagine if he did do it before, then it would just be a ticker tape parade for them, because they'd actually have something to point at him. I mean, to say that the delay is somehow nefarious, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But I think, people do want to see justice for Donald Trump. And, the Supreme Court has just handed him win after win after win in ways that I think are deeply, deeply troubling and maybe even contrary to the plain language of the Constitution. So that's really the bigger problem in my mind. I think that the wheels will hum along in New York as they have. That was the case everybody thought should not have been brought. That was the weakest case. And I think that's the one that's going to end up with a sentence, whether he's president or not.
Now, moving over to D.C., we are waiting now for the end of this month, where the process will begin of this mini trial, and that's at the hands of Judge Chutkan. How impactful do you think that will be in terms of reminding Americans about the crimes that Donald Trump is facing right now in what many believe to be the strongest case against him?
Yeah, I guess it depends on who, if these mini trials go forward, what witnesses are called. One of the pivotal witnesses for the government that I think is a problem potentially for the government is former Vice President Mike Pence, because the Supreme Court said two things. They said, kind of astonishingly, to the extent to which Donald Trump called the vice president and told him to take an unconstitutional act and actually not fulfill his obligations under the law and not to gavel in the presidency for Joe Biden, that's protected conduct, that there's no oversight of that, but said to the extent to which Vice President Pence was operating as a Senate actor in his obligations to actually do that for the Senate, that might be unofficial conduct. And then the third piece, Brian, which I think is brilliant, is Jack Smith is trying to reframe the whole thing around president versus candidate. So this is a tight wire balancing act. I think people will pay attention if we see something new, if we see a big name kind of have to testify. But we all sat through years ago now, or a long time ago, the January 6th hearings and investigations, and it's just astonishing that it's a collective shrug these days, and it's one that comes from the highest court in the land, somehow basically pointing fingers at the Justice Department, suggesting it was abusive to actually take steps to prosecute that. That's what's still in this moment is stunning. And I don't think anything that could happen in Judge Chutkan's courtroom can change things in this moment.
Well, moving over to the other federal prosecution that Trump is contending with, and that's in Florida, do you anticipate that this case will be moved back into the trial court system after the 11th Circuit has its hearing on whether this should have been dismissed in the way that Judge Cannon did? And if so, do you think that there will be some way in which, whether it's the 11th Circuit itself or Jack Smith's prosecutorial team, asks for a new judge other than Judge Cannon herself, which would seem to make sense because she's hell-bent on making sure that this case doesn't see the light of day, that Donald Trump isn't held accountable for his crimes?
I think the 11th Circuit's going to reverse her for sure. I mean, because there are 4 federal statutes, excuse me, and a Supreme Court decision that go against her ruling. But I also think that Donald Trump will appeal that to the U.S. Supreme Court. And given that Clarence Thomas gratuitously, in a concurring opinion, gave her a roadmap for this. When I say it was gratuitous, that case didn't have anything to do. The immunity question had nothing to do with the constitutionality of Jack Smith's appointment. So he went out on a limb to go outside the scope of that decision or even the topic to give her that roadmap. But let me say one more thing. Donald Trump has said to Judge Chutkan in the January 6th case that he plans to raise the constitutionality of Jack Smith. So I think the Justice Department understands they have to win this one. And I think that one will go to the court. The question is, can Thomas get 4 more justices on board? We don't know, right? Now, whether when it's remanded, whether they try to get her replaced, I know that our friend Glenn Kirshner has encouraged that for a long time. Her behavior is clearly biased, clearly deeply problematic, but it's a very high hurdle to overcome. And I think the bigger issue is, why he chose to be in Florida to begin with. They might have had jurisdiction in Washington or venue in Washington, but now that the court has said that official acts are protected, maybe they have to be in Florida because he packed up the boxes in Washington, right? And then he did the obstruction allegedly in Florida. So my guess is they'll stay in Florida, and if they get a win on Jack Smith's appointment, my guess is they'll stick with her.
I want to move over to the book now because it's very relevant to all of the stuff that we're talking about. So first off, Donald Trump has promised to pardon the more than 1,000 convicted insurrectionists who were involved in the events of January 6th. Is this the first time that you know of where a president is effectively dangling a pardon not just for already committed criminal activity in terms of what these insurrectionists did on January 6th, but effectively encouraging more violence, more criminal activity by signaling to his supporters that if the need for another January 6th arises again, that they will be protected by a presidential pardon in the event Trump wins?
It's really stunning. I don't know if it's the first time in American history. I mean, remember when President Johnson took over for Abraham Lincoln, there were pardons by Lincoln of Confederates, there were pardons by Johnson of Confederate soldiers, and the idea was, listen, we need to get people back in the Union. Lincoln wanted them back in the Army, and so was giving pardons to encourage them to join the Union. And then Johnson, the idea was we need to move on. I don't think by any stretch of the imagination, dangling these pardons for the insurrectionists has anything to do with healing the nation. And there was a study done this summer. There was a survey, it's on Protect Democracy's website, done this summer, of Republicans and Democrats, and of a majority of both sides of the aisle of Americans did not want to see pardons for the January 6th insurrectionists. Why? Precisely because, as you indicate, they don't want a green light for political violence. People don't want a green light for political violence, but that is what Donald Trump, in part, is running his campaign on. So there are a lot of reasons, additional reasons we can talk about. Certainly, green lighting not only political violence, but his own private militia, potentially, that'll have his back no matter what with their guns. We saw another disgraceful, painful episode of gun violence in school in Georgia this week. That is deeply, deeply troubling. But the pardon, Brian, the problems, a colleague of mine called it the open sewer of pardon. The pardon problem right now goes far beyond the January 6th insurrectionists. It has a lot to do with that immunity decision we were talking about.
To that exact point, there are, of course, pundits out there. I don't know whether they're saying this to troll us or just because they're actually being earnest about it, but they're suggesting that Joe Biden should pardon Donald Trump, or I suppose the same logic could be extended to Kamala Harris if she wins in November, that she should then pardon Donald Trump, and that's the only way we could truly move on and heal as a country. What are your thoughts on that prospect?
That's a political question, and I would obviously, and I would imagine that would happen with some idea that maybe Kamala Harris would want to get buy-in from the United States Congress, from the Republicans, to get more of her agenda moved forward. Like, so, okay, if we're going to move forward as a nation, I'll do this pardon, but then you need to do something for me, and start making laws and taking actions for the American people. As a non-political pundit, watching the way this has gone since January 6th, with the Republican Party signing on really to totalitarianism, to authoritarianism, to a version of democracy that has nothing to do with democracy. If I were Kamala Harris, I wouldn't touch that deal with a 10-foot pole. I think
Correct.
there's enough people that also want to see justice for Donald Trump. Why? Because we are worried, and I include myself, in the prospect of the end of American democracy. And just to my point on the pardon, what the Supreme Court did in creating criminal immunity is basically say, presidents, you can commit crimes in office. They're saying, we're assuming you're going to do it. If you commit crimes in office, you just better use official power. But you're going to need people to execute orders if you're using official power. How do you do that? You pair it with the pardon. So you take immunity plus pardon, and all of a sudden you've got a criminal gang in the White House that might never want to leave. So the last thing I would think that someone like Joe Biden or Kamala Harris should really do in this moment is say, good job, I'm going to reward you for that, which is one version of a pardon. I would not want to see that personally.
Well, it also sets up an incentive structure where Republicans then know that they can commit criminal activity, and that until and unless that person is absolved by Democrats, then they can withhold any participation in the functioning of government. And so they can just keep committing criminal activity and say, okay, but you better let him go. Otherwise, we're not going to do anything. I think the better move here is just to elect people who actually believe in the core functions of government and don't use it as a carrot, basically, to commit criminal activity for themselves, and then force Democrats' hands in terms of absolving them for that criminal activity if they want any buy-in from Republicans to do the most basic core functions of government.
Couldn't agree more. And plus, honestly, Brian, I think this would be the last pardon needed, because with the immunity decision, you can just commit crimes. You don't need a self-pardon. You don't need a pardon because there's no criminal liability.
Right.
So it would also be like the seal on the deal of the end of an accountable White House, an accountable executive branch. And as I explain this, when people don't, sometimes people are visual thinkers or visual learners. If you think about a monarchy, an unlimited monarchy, it's a triangle. The president or the king is at the top, the power comes from God, and it sprinkles down to the subjects based on the king's whims. And that's the idea behind the pardon. Could dole out mercy if you kiss the ring enough. The American democracy is an inverted triangle. The people are at the top, and the power trickles down to presidents. Presidents are not kings. And the Supreme Court basically rewrote that part of Article 2. And anyone who suggests, which I've heard, that that's an exaggeration, or even worse, that it's an exaggeration to imagine what we're talking about could ever happen, I think we get in our time machine and talk to the revolutionaries, talk to the framers of the Constitution. Do you think they fought and died to kick out King George III because they believed that, every king will be a benevolent king, so why do we need government by the people? Right. No, it was an amazing thing that they created in the history of humankind, an idea where people were their own self-government. And that is literally on the line in this moment. And I hope everybody votes like their future depends on it, and their children's future depends on it. Because if you're too young to vote, you've got to rely on older generations to preserve this, and the stakes could not be greater.
I think that's a great point too, in the sense that we for so long have become accustomed to this idea that our democracy is a given, that people will abide by the peaceful transfer of power. In fact, what Donald Trump is doing is very, very much in line with his Make America Great Again backwards-looking view, is reiterating what we've seen throughout history, which is that people are, in fact, not willing to cede power once they have it. And so, again, like his whole platform is very backward-looking, and I think that what we're seeing now is just a kind of a nod to times past, to the exact point that you're making.
Yeah, it's historical. I didn't do a lot of history in college, but I wish I did, because, it does repeat. And why does it repeat? James Madison said in the Federalist Papers, if men were angels, we would not need government. Ambition needs to made to counteract ambition, just like you said. When people get power, they want more. They want to entrench it and not give it up. And ultimately it gets abused because there's no checks and balances. I mean, if you drive down the street and there's a speed limit, you'll speed. You'll go 45 and a 35 until there's accountability, until you get the ticket for speeding. Where's the tickets for speeding in the White House? And what dictator promised to not leave, promised to rule subjects, like he has said, promised to change government, to put loyalists in government, and to use the power of the Justice Department, the power of prosecutors, the surveillance, to get at his political enemies? Who did all that stuff, then gets the power, and then decides, nah, I'm not going to actually use it? I mean, I'm not a historian, but I've heard historians say, never. And why? It's because that's how our brains work.
Right. I do want to harken back to something that you mentioned before, and that is that, if Trump wins in November, the pardon power actually factors quite heavily into his presidency, wherein he himself would, of course, enjoy full immunity, but his acolytes who don't enjoy presidential immunity because they're not the president could also then engage in criminal activity because the Supreme Court did announce that pardons, too, are effectively untouchable. So can you speak on that? Does this not fly in the face of the spirit of what pardons are supposed to do, or are they truly intended to just be an instrument wielded by a president that should not and cannot be challenged, period, full stop?
Yeah, I mean, that's the toxic mix that you just said that I don't think people are understanding. Pardons plus immunity is just a disaster zone. I mean, that is just an extraordinarily amount of power, thanks to the United States Supreme Court. To answer your question, yes and no, in that when, kings of England had the pardon power, they abused it. They were kings. But the idea behind the pardon power, which goes all the way back to pre-biblical times, the Code of Hammurabi in ancient Babylonia, and of course the famous pardon. Jesus Christ was denied a pardon by the Roman people in favor of a murderer named Barabbas. And Jesus Christ, Christian religion, is based on the denial of a pardon. The idea of a pardon, though, is was not a criminal justice system back then. There was not jury trials until the 13th century. There were not 4th, 5th, 6th Amendments. There were not appeals. There were not judges. There was not procedural rights and systems. And so the king had to come in sometimes and make sure, I talk about in the book, a 4-year-old girl who pushes her brother into a boiling water. You make sure a child doesn't get a death sentence, right? Or you kind of stop this cycle of violence. And then, kings would send pardon convicts and send them to the America and Australia, right, in exchange for a pardon. So when James Madison and Alexander Hamilton argued for a broad pardon power at the Constitutional Convention, rejecting proposals to require Senate consent, rejecting proposals to ban pardons for treason, their argument was, you need to have somebody to exercise mercy. There needs to be a stopgap, a valve. And at that point too, we didn't have the Bill of Rights. There needs to be some protections. The idea that somehow translates into using, the SEAL Team 6 to assassinate political rivals and then pardoning the SEAL Team 6 members and anyone. I mean, of course, Brian, that's totally antithetical to the idea behind democracy and government by the people and liberty and all the things that are underpinnings of our system of government. It's ridiculous.
Well, it was an excellent read, and obviously I think there's so much more here to dive into, and I wish we did have more time to do exactly that. But for folks watching right now, please do yourself a favor, grab the book, Pardon Power, How the Pardon System Works and Why. Kim, thank you so much for taking the time. I appreciate it.
It was really fun. Thanks for having me.